Imagine a city where the streets glittered with gold mosaics, where soaring domes reached toward heaven, and where whispers in the palace could decide the fate of millions. This was Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, a place where power was absolute and ambition could either crown you or destroy you. Yet in a world dominated by emperors, two extraordinary women shattered every expectation. One began her life as an actress scorned by polite society, only to rise as an empress who would defy riots and rewrite laws. The other was born into privilege, raised to serve as the guardian of her son's throne, but ended up seizing the crown for herself, daring to call herself not empress but emperor. Their names were Theodora and Irene, and their legacies remain among the most fascinating and controversial in history. Their reigns were marked by courage, scandal, reform, betrayal, and faith. Theodora, wife of Justinian, used her voice and resolve to steady an empire on the verge of collapse, while also reshaping the laws to protect women and the vulnerable. Irene, centuries later, maneuvered through intrigue and rebellion, ultimately blinding her own son to rule alone, even as she restored the veneration of icons and won a place of honor in the Orthodox Church. Were they ruthless tyrants or visionary leaders far ahead of their time? The truth is as complex as Byzantium itself, and it is in that complexity that their stories still capture our imagination today. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we are diving deep into the lives of Theodora and Irene, two empresses who defied tradition, reshaped power, and left legacies that continue to spark debate. Stay with us as we unravel their extraordinary journeys. The world of Byzantium often evokes images of towering mosaics, domes of gold, and emperors robed in purple. Yet behind that shimmering facade lies the story of two women who altered the direction of the empire in ways few could have imagined. To understand them is not only to trace the shape of political authority in the medieval East, but also to examine the tension between social expectations, personal will, and the structures of imperial power. From the outset, their stories resist easy categorization. Theodora, whose earliest years were marked by obscurity and the shame of performance in the circus, transformed herself into one of the most commanding voices at the side of Justinian. Irene, born into nobility and destined from childhood for high rank, followed a seemingly predetermined path to rule, though her reign would demonstrate that privilege carried its own burden of expectations and conflict. Together they reveal how Byzantium could be both rigid and remarkably flexible, unforgiving yet open to reinvention, and how women, often written out of the narrative of imperial history, could carve legacies that would outlast those of many emperors. Theodora's rise has often been described as improbable, and indeed in a society that prized lineage and respectability, she began at what seemed the farthest point from power. Accounts by contemporaries and later chroniclers vary in their details, some clouded by hostility or moralistic judgment, but most agree she was the daughter of a bear trainer attached to the hippodrome. The circus was not merely entertainment, but a social and political space, a ground where factions clashed and popular opinion was forged. To emerge from this environment was both a mark of lowly origins and a testament to resilience. Theodora, likely performing on stage at an early age, was exposed to ridicule, lust, and the harsh world of spectacle. Yet in the very marginality of this life, she developed a form of fearlessness that would later prove essential. If she learned to read an audience, command attention, and harden herself against judgment, these qualities would serve her well when she stepped into the palace. Her meeting with Justinian has been portrayed in different lights, some romantic, others pragmatic. What is certain is that Justinian, nephew of the Emperor Justin and a man with lofty ambitions, was captivated not only by her beauty but by her intelligence. At a time when law barred men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses or women of low station, Justinian pressed for a change in legislation. The marriage that followed was extraordinary, not least because it symbolized a union of opposite worlds. The aspiring ruler whose every move was calculated to secure the throne, and the woman whose very presence challenged elite notions of propriety. Yet Theodora was not a silent partner. From the beginning, she exerted influence, her counsel valued even when it clashed with the opinions of generals or senators. The most famous moment that captured her resolve came during the Nika Riots. The uprising, fueled by discontent with taxation and the rivalry of circus factions, escalated into near-total rebellion. The palace was under siege, and Justinian himself contemplated flight. It was Theodora who steadied him with words that have echoed through history, a declaration that she would not trade the imperial purple for safety, for the crown was the noblest shroud. Whether these words were spoken exactly as later recorded is secondary to the point. She embodied an unflinching commitment to power, persuading her husband to stand firm. The decision led to brutal suppression, with thousands slain in the hippodrome, but it preserved Justinian's reign and, by extension, Theodora's influence. In that crisis, her past as a woman scorned by society may have fused with her present as empress, creating a resolve that even seasoned statesmen could not match. Theodora's impact, however, cannot be reduced to one dramatic moment. Her role in shaping imperial policy, particularly on issues concerning women, marks her as exceptional. Procopius, often critical of her, nevertheless admitted she had strong views on morality and justice. Laws under Justinian began to reflect a greater concern for the vulnerable, especially women trapped in exploitation. Regulations were issued to curb trafficking and to provide refuge for women leaving prostitution. Critics could dismiss these as hypocritical reforms coming from someone with Theodora's background, but such arguments miss the deeper point. She understood the realities of women's suffering not as abstractions, but as lived experiences. To translate that into legal protection was a rare form of empathy in an age when female voices seldom shaped legislation. These reforms endured beyond her lifetime, proof that her mark on the empire was more than symbolic. Her influence also extended into theology, a realm where imperial power was deeply entangled. The debates over Christ's nature, whether he embodied one or two natures, divided the empire with ferocity. Theodora leaned toward the Monophysite position, a stance that set her apart from Justinian's more Chalcedonian approach. This divergence did not paralyze the court, but created a fascinating dual authority, where the empress acted as a patron of alternative theological communities, sheltering exiled clergy and supporting monasteries. In doing so, she shaped not only politics but also the spiritual landscape of Byzantium. The fact that a woman could exert such theological influence within an ostensibly male-dominated ecclesiastical hierarchy underscores how Theodora's power transcended conventional boundaries. If Theodora's story is one of ascent from the margins, Irene's is one of birthright tested by adversity. Born into an aristocratic family of Athens, she was chosen to marry Leo, son of Constantine V, and thus entered the imperial household already destined for prominence. The marriage was part of a broader strategy to secure loyalty among Greek elites, yet Irene's personal trajectory far exceeded the initial calculation. When Leo ascended the throne as Leo IV, Irene became empress consort, and upon his death, she assumed regency for her young son, Constantine VI. This moment placed her in a delicate position. To act decisively was to invite criticism for overstepping maternal bounds, yet to act timidly was to lose control to rival factions. Irene chose the path of assertion. Her regency was marked by political maneuvering and a keen understanding of symbolism. Coins and official documents bore her image alongside her son's, signaling to the empire that she was not merely a caretaker, but a sovereign authority. Yet it was in the realm of religion that she staked her greatest claim. The iconoclastic controversy had torn Byzantium for decades, with emperors and bishops clashing over whether the veneration of icons was permissible. Irene, unlike her iconoclast predecessors, positioned herself as a defender of images, a choice that aligned her with monastic communities and popular devotion. She convened the Second Council of Nicaea, restoring the veneration of icons and thereby reversing the policies of earlier emperors. This act not only stabilized religious life, but also won her a lasting place in the memory of the Orthodox Church. Yet Irene's authority came at a cost. As her son reached maturity, tensions between them grew. Constantine VI, eager to assert his own power, sought to edge his mother aside. The conflict culminated in a shocking episode. Irene, determined not to yield, ordered her son's blinding, an act that rendered him incapable of ruling. The brutality of this decision cannot be softened, and it earned her condemnation even from sympathetic sources. Yet it also reveals the stark reality of imperial politics. To preserve power in Byzantium often required measures that appear unthinkable today. Irene may have justified the act as necessary for the stability of the empire, but in doing so she crossed a line that forever shaped her legacy. After this, Irene ruled as sole empress, an unprecedented position in Byzantine history. She was not regent, not consort, but Basilius, emperor in her own right. This was more than semantics. In official documents, her title carried the same authority as that of her male predecessors. To see a woman in such a position challenged the gendered assumptions of Byzantine governance and startled observers in the West. Charlemagne, crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, was in part justified by the claim that the Byzantine throne was vacant, occupied not by a legitimate man but by a woman. Irene's reign thus inadvertently shaped the broader geopolitical order, creating a division between East and West that would echo for centuries. When we place Theodora and Irene side by side, the contrasts are striking yet complementary. Theodora, rising from poverty and scandal, and Irene, born into aristocracy, both defied the roles expected of women in their society. One embodied resilience forged in hardship, the other wielded privilege with ruthless calculation. Yet both reveal that imperial power in Byzantium was never the sole preserve of men. Each, in her way, demonstrated that authority depended not simply on birth or gender, but on the ability to navigate crises, command loyalty, and impose a vision upon a complex and often hostile environment. Their stories also invite reflection on the nature of legitimacy. For Theodora, legitimacy was constantly contested, shadowed by her origins and the whispers of scandal. She overcame this not by erasing her past, but by redefining what imperial dignity meant, embodying courage, moral reform, and theological advocacy. For Irene, legitimacy was her birthright, but it was undermined by her gender and by the suspicion that she had overreached. Her decision to blind her son, while securing her throne, cast a shadow that no amount of religious piety could fully dispel. In both cases, legitimacy was not a fixed inheritance but a battle waged daily in the court, in the church, and in the streets of Constantinople. The legacies of Theodora and Irene extend beyond their lifetimes. Theodora's reforms for women remind us that even within rigid hierarchies, personal experience could shape compassionate policy. Her support for Monophysites, though controversial, reveals the empire's pluralism and the ability of a determined individual to shelter dissenting voices. Irene's restoration of icons secured her veneration in the Orthodox tradition, where she is remembered not as a usurper but as a saintly figure who defended holy images. At the same time, her ruthless pursuit of power stands as a cautionary tale about the costs of ambition. Together, they underscore the paradoxes of Byzantine history, where sanctity and cruelty, compassion and ambition could reside within the same person. If we step back, the significance of these women lies not only in their personal deeds, but in what they represent about the empire itself. Byzantium, with all its rituals, bureaucracy, and dynastic struggles, could still accommodate figures who broke the mold. It could elevate a former performer to the throne and entrust a woman with sole imperial authority. This flexibility is part of what allowed the empire to endure for centuries, adapting to crises by finding strength in unlikely places. Theodora and Irene were not anomalies to be dismissed, but central figures whose lives reveal the possibilities and contradictions of Byzantine rule. As history moved forward, later rulers would look back on them with mixed feelings. To some, they were examples of divine providence, proof that God could raise the lowly and sanctify the courageous. To others, they were reminders of the dangers of unchecked power, particularly in the hands of those who defied convention. Modern readers can appreciate both views, seeing in Theodora and Irene not simply heroines or villains, but complex leaders whose choices were shaped by the pressures of their time. They remind us that history is rarely neat, that power is never pure, and that the paths to authority are as varied as the individuals who walk them. This is not a story that concludes with triumph or tragedy alone. It is a story of survival, of ambition, of reform, and of betrayal. It is a narrative that forces us to ask difficult questions about how societies remember women in power, and how those memories are shaped by both admiration and suspicion. In Theodora and Irene, Byzantium produced figures who still speak to us, not because they fit our ideals, but because they challenge them. They compel us to consider how power is gained, how it is used, and how it is judged long after it is gone. Their shadows stretch across the centuries, reminding us that the empire they reshaped was built not only by emperors, but also by empresses who dared to rule. Theodora's rise to power was not only a remarkable personal transformation, but also a case study in how strength, intelligence, and strategy could rewrite the rules of a world dominated by men. To move from the stage to the throne was never going to be easy, and the obstacles in her path were not just the whispers of courtiers or the disdain of aristocrats. They were the entrenched structures of Byzantine society, which defined a woman's worth by her family's reputation, her modesty, and her ability to remain invisible in political life. Theodora defied all of these conventions, and in doing so she provoked hostility from some of the most powerful men in the empire. Yet what stands out about her is not that she faced resistance, but that she overcame it, crafting a position for herself so strong that she became indispensable to Justinian and impossible for others to ignore. In the early years of her marriage, Theodora was constantly under scrutiny. Senators and courtiers viewed her with suspicion, convinced that her past as an actress and performer would taint the dignity of the throne. Procopius, the court historian who famously wrote a scandalous secret history, depicts her in the most unfavorable terms, claiming she manipulated Justinian through her charm and wit while masking ruthless ambition. Whether or not these accounts are exaggerated, they reveal the anxiety she inspired. In a world where female influence was expected to be subtle and hidden, Theodora's confidence, her sharp tongue, and her willingness to speak in public settings seemed shocking. What her enemies saw as scandalous, however, her supporters recognized as strength. It was precisely her boldness that made her stand out in an environment where silence was expected. Theodora quickly learned how to navigate the complex and often treacherous politics of the court. She did not waste energy trying to win over everyone, nor did she pretend to fit the mold of the demure empress. Instead, she built her own networks of loyalty, aligning herself with individuals who recognized her authority. She supported the marginalized, especially women, and through this gained a reputation as a protector of those without a voice. This role was more than symbolic. By establishing herself as someone who could deliver real change, she made herself too valuable to be dismissed. Even those who disliked her privately could not deny that she contributed to the stability of Justinian's regime. She mastered the art of balancing fear and respect, which in Byzantium was often the surest path to survival. Her legislative influence is one of the clearest examples of how she transformed her personal experiences into imperial policy. Byzantine law had long reflected the biases of a society that viewed women as dependents, subject to the control of fathers, brothers, or husbands. For women of the lower classes, especially those drawn into prostitution, there were few protections. Theodora, who had known firsthand the cruelty of public ridicule and the exploitation of women in entertainment, used her position to push for reforms that would ease some of these burdens. Justinian's codification of Roman law, one of the most ambitious legal projects in history, bears marks of her influence in this area. Laws were introduced to outlaw trafficking and to provide safe houses for women trying to escape prostitution. One such refuge, the Monastery of Repentance in Constantinople, was created specifically to give women a chance at a new life away from the streets and the stage. These reforms were not limited to issues of morality or exploitation. Theodora also took steps to strengthen the position of women within marriage. Legislation was passed making it easier for women to initiate divorce in cases of abuse, protecting them from being trapped in destructive relationships. Other laws imposed harsher penalties on men who committed sexual violence, signaling a shift toward recognizing women's suffering as worthy of imperial concern. For critics, these measures may have seemed radical, but they were consistent with Theodora's broader vision. That power should be used to protect the vulnerable. In a society where women were often invisible in public discourse, these reforms gave them a rare acknowledgement and, in some cases, genuine protection. They did not overturn the deeply patriarchal structure of Byzantine life, but they carved out space for justice where previously there had been none. Her legislative achievements were matched by her presence in moments of acute crisis. The most dramatic of these was the Nika Riots, when Constantinople itself was on the brink of collapse. The revolt, sparked by discontent with taxes and the rivalry of the Blues and Greens, the great circus factions, quickly grew into an outright rebellion against Justinian. The city burned, the palace was besieged, and the emperor's advisors urged retreat. Justinian himself was ready to flee, convinced that survival depended on abandoning the capital and regrouping elsewhere. It was at this moment that Theodora spoke words that would become legendary. She reminded her husband and his court that imperial dignity was worth more than life itself. She is said to have declared that the purple is the noblest shroud, meaning that to die as emperor and empress was better than to live in disgrace. Whether the exact phrasing is accurate or not, the spirit of her intervention is clear. She was the one who steadied the resolve of the government at its darkest hour. Her speech did more than persuade Justinian to stay. It forced him to act decisively. Instead of retreat, he ordered his generals Belisarius and Mundus to crush the uprising. The result was brutal. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in the hippodrome. Yet the alternative would have been the overthrow of the regime and perhaps the disintegration of the empire. In this sense, Theodora's courage saved not only Justinian's reign, but also the continuity of Byzantine authority at a time when it could have fractured irreparably. The lesson of the Nika Riots is that power is not only about armies or laws, but about the will to hold steady when everything appears lost. In that moment, it was Theodora, not Justinian, who embodied imperial resolve. The aftermath of the riots confirmed her indispensability. Justinian's authority had survived, but it was clear to all that Theodora's presence was central to that survival. From then on, she was more than consort. She was co-ruler in all but name. Her enemies could continue to whisper about her past, but her role in preserving the throne was undeniable. This gave her a political legitimacy that no hostile gossip could undo. It also deepened her influence over policy and court life, allowing her to continue shaping the empire in ways that were consistent with her vision. Her support for Monophysitism provides another dimension to her influence. In an empire fractured by theological disputes, she chose to align herself with a movement often persecuted by the official church. Monophysite clergy found in her a patron and protector, and she used her authority to shelter exiled bishops and monks. This religious stance put her at odds with Justinian at times, who pursued reconciliation with Chalcedonian orthodoxy, yet the coexistence of their differing views highlights her independence. She was not content to follow passively the line of imperial policy, but insisted on advancing her own convictions. This independence was unusual for an empress, and underscores how she redefined the possibilities of female authority within the Byzantine court. Theodora's story, when viewed as a whole, is a study in resilience, transformation, and the exercise of power under constant scrutiny. From the stage, where she was objectified and mocked, she learned to command attention. From the hostility of the court, she developed the skill of turning scandal into strength. From her empathy with the vulnerable, she forged laws that offered protection where none had existed. From the chaos of the Nika Riots, she showed that courage could mean the difference between collapse and survival. Her reign was not without its controversies, and her methods often provoked criticism, but her impact was undeniable. She stands as proof that legitimacy in Byzantium could be won not only by birth or conquest, but also by sheer will and the ability to act decisively when others faltered. To reflect on Theodora's legacy is to confront the paradoxes of power itself. She was both a figure of compassion and of ruthless resolve, a woman shaped by hardship who used her position to ease the suffering of others, and at the same time a leader willing to sanction bloodshed to preserve the throne. Her story challenges simple categories of villain or heroine. Instead, it compels us to see her as a complex individual navigating the unforgiving world of imperial politics. In her, we see the embodiment of Byzantium's contradictions: glittering beauty and brutal violence, deep piety and relentless ambition, social rigidity and surprising flexibility. She did not erase these contradictions but lived them fully, leaving behind a legacy that still commands attention. Theodora's journey from the stage to the throne demonstrates how unexpected figures could redefine the possibilities of leadership. She began with no noble lineage, no inheritance, and no allies of high standing. What she had instead was intelligence, resilience, and the ability to turn every disadvantage into an advantage. In her, we see the story of Byzantium itself, a society that held fast to tradition but was capable of astonishing reinvention. Without her, Justinian's reign would likely have been remembered very differently, if it had survived at all. With her, it became one of the most dynamic periods in the history of the empire. Theodora reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who fit its expected molds, but often by those who dare to break them. Irene's life and reign reveal not only the ambitions of a single woman, but also the shifting boundaries of power in Byzantium, where personal will, theological debate, and dynastic survival constantly intertwined. To move from the position of regent to that of sole ruler was unprecedented for a woman, and the fact that she achieved this against immense resistance makes her one of the most fascinating figures in medieval history. Her journey began within the conventions of aristocratic expectation, but she quickly demonstrated that she was not content with ceremonial roles. Instead, she reshaped the imperial office itself, forcing both contemporaries and later generations to reconsider what was possible for a woman in a system so carefully guarded by tradition. When her husband Leo IV died, Irene assumed regency for their young son, Constantine VI. The initial years of her rule required a delicate balance. On the one hand, she had to maintain the image of a protective mother safeguarding her child's inheritance. On the other hand, she had to exert real authority in a court filled with generals, advisors, and ambitious relatives who might otherwise sideline her. She proved herself adept at this balancing act, asserting herself firmly while cloaking her actions in the language of maternal duty. From the very beginning, she showed a willingness to use strategy and, when necessary, ruthlessness to maintain control. Courtiers who opposed her quickly discovered that her patience had limits. She built a coalition of allies loyal to her personally, using appointments, marriages, and patronage to strengthen her hand. Every step reinforced the reality that she was not a temporary caretaker, but a sovereign in her own right, even while her son remained the nominal emperor. The religious controversies of her age gave Irene the chance to assert herself even more forcefully. Byzantium had been torn for decades by the iconoclastic movement, which rejected the veneration of icons as idolatry. Previous emperors, including her father-in-law Constantine V, had pursued iconoclasm with zeal, dismantling images, persecuting monks, and reshaping religious life around their vision of purity. Irene, however, was an iconophile. She believed that icons were not idols but windows into the divine, essential for the spiritual life of the faithful. This conviction was not merely personal, it was also politically astute. Many within the church hierarchy and monastic communities shared her devotion to icons, and by aligning herself with them, she gained strong allies against the military aristocracy that had largely supported iconoclasm. Her greatest triumph in this sphere came with the Second Council of Nicaea, convened in the late 8th century. Through her careful planning, she gathered bishops and representatives to restore the veneration of icons, overturning the policies of her predecessors. This council did more than resolve a theological dispute. It legitimized her rule by presenting her as the restorer of orthodoxy, the empress who had healed a fractured church. It also gave her spiritual credibility that no general or rival could easily undermine. The restoration of icons was celebrated not only within the empire, but also beyond its borders, marking Byzantium as the guardian of true faith. This achievement secured her lasting place in the memory of the Orthodox Church, where she is still honored as a champion of holy images. Yet the very strength she displayed as regent created tensions with her son as he came of age. Constantine VI, eager to assert his independence, found himself increasingly overshadowed by his mother. While he bore the title of emperor, it was clear to all that Irene was the one making the critical decisions. For the young ruler, this was intolerable. He attempted to assert himself, but Irene had already laid the groundwork for her dominance. She had cultivated loyal officials in the bureaucracy, secured support from the clergy, and built a network of influence that left Constantine with little room to maneuver. The conflict between them escalated until it became impossible to reconcile. Eventually, Irene took the extraordinary step of ordering her son's blinding, an act that ensured he could never rule independently again. This moment is one of the most shocking in Byzantine history. For a mother to inflict such cruelty upon her son seemed to many a violation of both natural and divine law. Even those who admired her earlier achievements struggled to excuse this decision. Yet from Irene's perspective, the stakes were clear. To relinquish power to Constantine would have undone years of careful consolidation and threatened the survival of her religious policies. To secure her vision of empire, she believed she had to act decisively, no matter the cost. This ruthless act cemented her authority, but it also cast a long shadow over her reputation. She could now rule without challenge, but she did so at the price of being remembered as a mother who destroyed her own child to hold the throne. After Constantine's fall, Irene no longer hid behind the title of regent or mother. She took the bold step of declaring herself Basilius, emperor rather than empress. This was more than a matter of language. In the Byzantine system, the title of emperor carried full sovereignty, while empress suggested a consort or secondary status. By calling herself emperor, Irene made it clear that she was not a placeholder, but the ruler in her own right. Coins, documents, and ceremonies all reflected this new reality. The empire had never seen a woman hold the title before, and the symbolism reverberated throughout the political world. Some within Byzantium accepted it as the natural outcome of her long dominance, but others viewed it as a scandalous distortion of tradition. In the West, the Pope used her gender as a pretext to crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, arguing that the Byzantine throne was effectively vacant because it was occupied by a woman. In this sense, Irene's boldness reshaped not only the empire, but also the larger political map of Europe. Her reign as sole emperor highlighted both the possibilities and the limits of female power in Byzantium. On the one hand, she showed that a woman could rule in every respect as a man might, directing foreign policy, overseeing taxation, and making theological decisions. On the other hand, her position remained precarious, constantly challenged by those who believed that her gender made her unfit for the role. The later years of her reign were marked by conspiracies and plots, as courtiers and generals sought to replace her with a more conventional male ruler. Eventually, she was deposed and exiled, dying in relative obscurity. Yet her fall did not erase her achievements. Instead, it underscored the extraordinary fact that she had held the throne for as long as she did in defiance of every convention. When we consider Irene alongside Theodora, the contrasts and similarities are revealing. Both women challenged the gendered expectations of their society, though they did so from very different starting points. Theodora rose from humble beginnings, her legitimacy constantly questioned, while Irene was born into aristocracy, her legitimacy undermined not by her past, but by her gender. Both understood that power required decisiveness, and both were willing to act with a ruthlessness that shocked contemporaries. Theodora faced down rebellion with courage that saved an empire, while Irene eliminated her own son to secure her rule. Theodora used her influence to pass laws that protected vulnerable women, while Irene used hers to restore icons and heal the church. Each, in her own way, redefined what it meant to rule Byzantium. Irene's legacy remains deeply complex. For the Orthodox Church, she is remembered as a saintly figure who defended the truth of the faith. For political historians, she is a figure of ambition whose decision to blind her son represents the darkest side of imperial power. For feminists and scholars of gender, she stands as proof that even in the most rigid of systems, women could seize and exercise authority at the highest level. Her reign demonstrates the fragility of legitimacy in Byzantium, where birth, gender, and theology constantly intersected to shape who could rule and how. She ruled alone not because the system welcomed her, but because she forced it to accept her, at least for a time. To reflect on Irene is to reflect on the nature of authority itself. Her life shows that power in Byzantium was never only about bloodlines or laws. It was about the ability to command loyalty, to shape religious policy, and to act decisively in moments of crisis. She proved that a woman could embody these qualities as fully as any man, though she also revealed the cost of such ambition. Her rule was both a triumph and a cautionary tale, celebrated for its achievements and haunted by its darkest choices. She dared to call herself emperor, and in doing so she left a mark on history that no amount of criticism or scandal could erase. Irene's story, like that of Theodora, shows us the extraordinary capacity of Byzantium to both resist and embrace change. The empire clung to tradition, yet found itself repeatedly shaped by those who defied it. It demanded conformity, yet was repeatedly rescued or reshaped by individuals who broke the rules. In Irene, we see the paradox of an empire that declared itself eternal and unchanging, yet allowed a woman to sit upon its throne as emperor. Her reign may have ended in exile, but her audacity ensures that she remains one of the most unforgettable figures of Byzantine history. The story of Byzantium cannot be told without lingering on the figures of Theodora and Irene, women whose lives unfolded centuries apart, yet who together embodied the potential and peril of female authority in a world largely defined by male power. Their legacies intersect at a fascinating point in history where personal ambition met imperial necessity, where tradition was at once rigid and pliable, and where the question of who could rule carried consequences not just for the empire, but for the very memory of leadership itself. To compare their impact is to step into a dialogue across time, a clash of legacies in which two very different models of power challenged assumptions and left marks that later rulers, male and female alike, could never entirely ignore. Theodora redefined power by refusing to let her lowly background confine her future. Her rise from the circus stage to the palace throne was a shock to Byzantine society, where lineage mattered above all else. She took the role of empress consort and made it something entirely new. In her, the empire saw not just a supportive spouse but an active shaper of policy, a co-ruler whose voice could not be silenced. She proved that legitimacy could be won through action and resolve rather than inherited status alone. By doing so, she expanded the boundaries of what female leadership could look like, creating a precedent for visibility, influence, and even legislative impact that outlasted her lifetime. Irene redefined power by turning maternal guardianship into sovereign rule. She began as a regent, expected to protect her son until he could assume control, but she transformed this temporary position into the foundation of her own authority. Through careful maneuvering and decisive action, she transitioned from Empress Mother to sole emperor, claiming the title that had never before been held by a woman. Unlike Theodora, whose power was partly rooted in partnership with Justinian, Irene asserted herself as the only ruler, willing to eliminate even her own son when he threatened her dominance. In doing so, she proved that the throne of Byzantium was not inherently closed to women, even if her path to it scandalized her contemporaries. The differences in how they ruled highlight two contrasting visions of authority. Theodora worked alongside Justinian, complementing his legal, military, and architectural ambitions with her own insight and resolve. Their reign was marked by a kind of duality, with both husband and wife contributing to the survival and flourishing of the empire. Theodora's decisive role in the Nika Riots exemplifies this partnership. Justinian faltered, she stood firm, and together they preserved the throne. She did not replace him, but instead reinforced him, her influence woven into the fabric of his rule so tightly that it is difficult to separate one from the other. Irene, by contrast, embodied the dangers and possibilities of singular ambition. She ruled not alongside a partner but against rivals, advisors, and eventually her own child. Her consolidation of power was absolute, and her use of the masculine title Basilius underscored her refusal to be relegated to a secondary role. Where Theodora's rule was collaborative, Irene's was solitary. Where Theodora wielded her influence through persuasion and partnership, Irene imposed hers through force and fear. This difference shaped not only how they were perceived, but also how their legacies unfolded. Theodora could be remembered as the courageous empress who saved her husband and shaped his reforms. Irene, though celebrated for restoring icons, could never escape the shadow of the act that secured her throne, the blinding of her son. Yet to frame them solely in terms of collaboration versus ambition would be to miss the broader currents that define their impact. Both women operated within a Byzantine system that was deeply suspicious of female authority. Theodora's background made her suspect, and Irene's gender made her vulnerable. Both faced criticism rooted not only in their decisions, but also in the very fact that they dared to act as rulers in their own right. What makes their stories remarkable is not that they faced resistance, but that they overcame it, each in her own way bending the structures of empire to accommodate her power. Their defiance of expectations carved out a space for women in imperial politics, a space that, even if rarely filled, could no longer be denied. Theodora's legacy echoes most clearly in the realm of law and social policy. Her advocacy for women, particularly those trapped in cycles of exploitation, left behind reforms that shifted the legal landscape of the empire. By securing protections against trafficking, offering safe refuge to former prostitutes, and strengthening women's rights within marriage, she gave voice to concerns rarely considered by emperors before her. These reforms were not mere footnotes to Justinian's codification of Roman law, but essential elements that reflected her personal experience and moral vision. Later rulers did not always build upon her efforts, yet the fact that such measures existed at all is testimony to her determination to reshape the empire in ways that acknowledged the lives of women otherwise invisible in history. Irene's legacy resonates most strongly in the sphere of religion and imperial symbolism. Her restoration of the veneration of icons through the Second Council of Nicaea remains one of the most celebrated moments in Orthodox history. For this achievement, she is remembered in the liturgy and honored as a defender of faith. At the same time, her decision to call herself emperor set a precedent that reverberated through the centuries. She showed that the imperial office was not inherently male, that the structures of ceremony, coinage, and law could be adapted to accommodate a woman who ruled alone. Later empresses who sought greater authority could point to Irene as proof that it had been done before. Even her critics, who decried her ruthlessness, could not erase the fact that she had dared to sit on the throne as Basilius. The echoes of their reigns carried forward into the memory of Byzantium. Theodora was remembered through the lens of Justinian's great achievements: the Hagia Sophia, the codification of law, the reconquest of lost territories. Her name was tied to his, but within that partnership, she retained a distinct identity as the empress who would not yield, the woman whose courage matched that of generals and whose compassion reached those society ignored. Irene was remembered more controversially, her legacy split between sanctity and scandal. In the church, she was revered for her defense of icons, yet in political histories, she was condemned for her ambition and cruelty. To Western observers, her rule was an aberration, a justification for crowning Charlemagne as emperor in her place. To Eastern admirers, she was a symbol of divine favor, proof that God could raise a woman to the highest throne. Together, their stories shaped how later generations understood the possibilities of female rule. They revealed that the Byzantine throne, though guarded by tradition, was not impenetrable to women. Their reigns also demonstrated the costs of breaking convention. Theodora endured slander and suspicion, never fully escaping the stigma of her origins. Irene faced conspiracy and eventual deposition, her gender used as both weapon and weakness by her enemies. Yet both left behind legacies that could not be ignored. They altered the conversation about power, forcing Byzantines to grapple with the question of what it meant for a woman to rule, and whether legitimacy could rest on courage, conviction, or ambition as much as on bloodline. Looking across the centuries, their impact extends beyond the boundaries of Byzantium. Theodora's reforms resonate with modern readers as early examples of social legislation aimed at protecting women from systemic exploitation. Irene's restoration of icons remains central to Orthodox spirituality, celebrated in feasts and prayers to this day. Both reveal that history's most enduring legacies often arise not from those who fit seamlessly into their world, but from those who defy its expectations. In Theodora and Irene, Byzantium produced leaders who challenged, reshaped, and expanded the very meaning of imperial authority. To compare their legacies is to see the empire itself in sharper relief. Byzantium was an organism constantly balancing tradition with innovation, rigidity with adaptability. Theodora and Irene, so different in origin and method, embody this tension. One rose from the margins, the other from the aristocracy. One ruled in partnership, the other alone. One left a legacy of compassion in law, the other of devotion in faith. Both, however, remind us that history is not the story of inevitability, but of individuals who dared to act against the grain. Their clash of legacies does not produce a single verdict of superiority, but instead offers a dialogue on what it means to rule, what it means to defy, and what it means to leave a mark that centuries cannot erase. Their influence on future rulers was subtle but real. Later empresses such as Zoe and Theodora in the 11th century, who briefly wielded power as sovereigns, operated in a world where Irene's precedent made their authority conceivable. The memory of Theodora, Justinian's partner, continued to inspire admiration for the idea of an empress as co-ruler, a voice not behind the throne but beside it. Even when women did not sit on the throne, their influence in court politics was measured against these two figures, who had shown both the heights of possibility and the dangers of ambition. In the end, the clash of their legacies reflects the larger story of Byzantium itself, a civilization marked by contradiction, resilience, and reinvention. Theodora and Irene remind us that the empire was never simply a series of emperors, but a living system shaped by those who dared to challenge its assumptions. They remind us that power is not static, but negotiated, contested, and redefined with every generation. And they remind us that history, far from being the tidy story of kings and conquests, is filled with voices that disrupt, redefine, and transform what seemed immutable. Theodora and Irene did not simply inhabit their roles, they expanded them. They left legacies that clash and complement, inspire and caution, sanctify and scandalize. Their stories endure not because they conformed, but because they refused to. And in that refusal lies the essence of their power, a reminder that leadership is as much about the courage to challenge expectations as it is about the ability to preserve traditions. In Byzantium, where eternity was the ideal, their lives prove that change often came from the least expected places, and that even within an empire of men, two women could redefine what it meant to rule. The stories of Theodora and Irene close like two strands of a single tapestry, woven centuries apart, but still catching the light of ambition, courage, and controversy in ways that continue to fascinate. Both stood at the very center of an empire that demanded reverence for tradition and continuity, yet each in her own way tore through those constraints, remaking the idea of what an empress could be. In examining their lives, one finds not simple tales of triumph or tragedy, but layered narratives of women who dared to wield authority in a world that was designed to keep them from it. Their names survive because they refused to be silent partners, and because they changed Byzantium in ways that cannot be untangled from the larger story of the empire itself. To ask whether Theodora and Irene were ruthless tyrants or visionary leaders is to step into a question that has no easy answer, one shaped as much by the prejudices of their contemporaries as by the distance of later centuries. Theodora was called scandalous, manipulative, and cruel by critics such as Procopius, who painted her in his secret history as a woman of unbridled appetites and shameless ambition. Yet in the same breath, the historical record acknowledges her as the savior of Justinian's throne, the champion of women's rights in a system that gave them little protection, and the protector of theological minorities against persecution. Irene, for her part, has been praised by the Orthodox Church as a saint for restoring the veneration of icons, yet condemned by political historians as a mother who blinded her own son to keep the throne. To some, she embodied piety and steadfast devotion. To others, she personified the very worst of imperial ruthlessness. What unites them, however, is that both were far more than the caricatures painted by their enemies or admirers. They were not merely tyrants, nor were they purely visionaries. They were rulers operating in an unforgiving environment where survival itself often required acts that appear shocking to modern eyes. Theodora's choice to suppress the Nika Riots with bloodshed was not merciful, but it preserved an empire that might otherwise have fractured. Irene's choice to blind Constantine VI was brutal beyond measure, but it ensured that her singular authority was unchallenged, allowing her to shape the empire according to her vision. Their ruthlessness and their vision cannot be separated. They were bound together, each act of cruelty entangled with the preservation of power, each moment of reform inseparable from the iron hand that made it possible. The personal struggles behind their reigns remind us that even on the golden throne of Constantinople, life was far from secure. Theodora carried with her the weight of a childhood marked by poverty, humiliation, and the dangers of life in the hippodrome's margins. Her reforms for women cannot be understood apart from her own lived experience of vulnerability. In her fight to change the laws that protected women from exploitation, we see not only an empress concerned with abstract justice, but a woman who remembered all too vividly what it meant to be powerless. Her triumph lay not only in holding power beside Justinian, but in transforming that power into something that recognized the humanity of women often forgotten by law and society. Irene's struggles were of a different kind. Born into nobility, she entered the palace with the pedigree expected of an empress, but she carried the constant burden of her gender in a world that defined sovereignty as male. Her regency began with the appearance of maternal duty, but the reality was a ceaseless struggle against advisors, generals, and aristocrats who sought to strip her of control. Her triumph was not only in securing her position, but in going further than any woman before her, declaring herself emperor, not empress, and inscribing her authority into the very language of power. Yet her triumph was also her tragedy. The price she paid for singular rule was the sacrifice of her son, and though it gave her the crown, it cost her reputation a stain that centuries of pious commemoration could not fully erase. Beyond the crowns, their stories continue to resonate because they touch on struggles that remain familiar today. Theodora's defiance of class prejudice and her determination to carve out dignity from a world that sought to deny it speaks to the timeless fight against social barriers. Irene's assertion that gender should not determine one's right to authority echoes in every later debate about women in positions of leadership. Both faced slander and resistance, and both endured. Their triumphs and failures remind us that the pursuit of power has always demanded resilience, sacrifice, and a willingness to bear the weight of judgment from those who could never imagine standing in their place. Their influence endures not simply because of what they achieved in law or theology, but because of what their lives symbolize. Theodora embodies the power of transformation, of turning scorn into authority, of using personal scars to shape a vision of justice. Irene embodies the audacity of ambition, the willingness to cross forbidden lines to claim what the world said she could not. Together, they represent two different but equally compelling forms of leadership, each with lessons and warnings for those who come after. If one must decide which empress is more compelling, The answer rests less in weighing their accomplishments against each other than in considering the nature of their appeal. Irene fascinates because of the sheer boldness of her claim to absolute power. In a system that had never seen a woman hold the title of emperor, she stood alone, reshaping the language and symbols of sovereignty to fit her. Her courage to defy tradition so completely, even at the cost of infamy, makes her unforgettable. Theodora, on the other hand, compels us because of the humanity beneath her power. She was not born into privilege, and every step of her ascent was marked by scorn, yet she turned her unlikely rise into an opportunity to legislate compassion. Where Irene inspires for her audacity, Theodora inspires admiration for her resilience and empathy. For me, Theodora is the more compelling of the two, not because her reign was free of ruthlessness. It was not, but because she managed to fuse survival with reform, power with purpose. Her legacy speaks not only of imperial ambition, but also of a determination to protect those who, like her younger self, were vulnerable and voiceless. Irene may dazzle with her audacious claim to the title of emperor, but Theodora's ability to turn personal struggle into systemic change makes her story resonate more deeply across the centuries. In the end, both remain icons of Byzantine ambition, but Theodora's journey from the margins to the throne, and her use of that throne to give dignity to others, is the one that compels me most.